Okay, well, I'm going to talk about, well, a controversial topic. Even among libertarians, there's a lot of dispute and discussion about these things. So I know that it's sensitive and controversial. Well, I welcome that, as we all do. And I hope that, you'll see these as ideas of mine. I don't wish to push them on anybody else. If you don't like them, just dismiss them. If you like them, then maybe they'd be inspirational to some thoughts that you may have of your own. And the reason I take on a controversial issue such as this, actually time and time again at Liberty International conferences, is because the issue never goes away, and it affects a lot of people. And there's a lot of suffering and hardship and positive opportunity and prosperity that comes with it. So it's worth examining. And I really have an enormous appreciation for the courage of a lot of people who are moving around the planet at all times. I have so much appreciation for their courage that I only wish that I would have such courage myself if I was in a similar situation. Would I be willing to give up everything that's familiar and go to places that are completely unfamiliar, potentially hostile, in order to rescue myself or my family and to find a better life away from persecution or where there's better job opportunities? The world is filled with lots of issues. We know in the news, it's all the time. Oh, there he is. There's Patrick. You met him today. Actually, he told me about the issues here in Lebanon. Lebanon was an interesting place to be there because he says there's 4 million Lebanese in Lebanon, and there's 12 million, maybe even up to 20 million, depending on who you ask, Lebanese abroad, especially in Europe and all of the Western Hemisphere. That's a lot. And in Lebanon, 2 million Syrians, not to mention another 500,000 Palestinians that are there. I mean, it's a country filled with lots of action and movement, and actually quite welcoming and humane for people in desperate trouble. There's a lot of people in Asia, the Rohingya, you've heard a lot about, and the terrible crises that they've been facing. Very good friends of ours, people who are part of the Liberty International, know Yomi Park and Shin Dun-yuk, who both spoken at our conferences. They both escaped from North Korea. Thousands of escapees from North Korea actually died or went into sex slavery, as Yomi Park revealed in her book. But fortunately for her and her mother and her sister, after a couple of years of terrible torture and hardship, I mean, at age 13, they were able to escape to Mongolia. And so Mongolia is a refuge for many of the people. Actually, she had to walk across the Gobi Desert, and they carried rat poison with them just so that they could take it in case they got captured by the Chinese and were sent back to North Korea, because it was certain death if they didn't. So these issues are very much present with us, not just for Americans who have it always in the news, but for Europeans as well. People everywhere. I heard from Ed Clark when I first learned about the Libertarian Party. Well, I didn't first hear about it, but he was the first presidential candidate of the Libertarian Party. Came to Hawaii one time and says, free market solutions are practical, they're humanitarian, and above all, they're ethical. That's why it's so easy to sell these ideas. First off, we know that the planet has been absorbing an awful lot of increased wealth. I mean, it's producing a lot for a lot of people. The population of the world has been rapidly on rise, and the number in dire poverty is in decline as a percentage of the population and in absolute numbers. It's been looking pretty good. For the world, it hasn't been the same for everybody. Some countries have been very, very prosperous, and some other countries have not changed much any more than maybe they were 1,000 years ago. The Fraser Institute in Canada has decided to give a very concrete way of evaluating the performance of countries around the world. What is it that makes it possible to reward the energy of work and ideas to create greater wealth? And they've come up with these 5 criteria. 1, the size of government spending, that's fiscal policy. legal and property rights, the contracts and legal system, sound money, that's the monetary policy, free trade, openness to trade, and the degrees of regulation over labor and other things in society. And they've ranked all the countries of the world on this list here. Always, Hong Kong's #1. Singapore and New Zealand follow right behind. And other countries like Venezuela, Myanmar, Zimbabwe, way down there at the bottom with the least economic freedom. And it matters. The countries that are ranked at the top have overwhelmingly the greatest amount of wealth per person. Countries low in the rank have very little amount of wealth per person. Even more important than that is the growth rate. The growth rate corresponds to economic freedom. And this is no more apparent than it is for the countries of Latin America and Asian tigers who've seen in 50 years from 1950 to the year 2000 very little change in the amount of wealth per person in those countries of Latin America. The rate pretty low on the Economic Freedom of the World Index. But the Asian tigers went from being the poorest countries of the world to being the wealthiest countries of the world. Hong Kong and Singapore now, Hong Kong has a higher per capita income than the United States. Singapore higher than England, the former colonial rulers of those countries. They've done extremely well. And so these things matter. Now China still ranks pretty low on the Economic Freedom of the World Index overall, but it's a very, very large country. Every province has as much population as probably most countries in the world. And China has done so well in its prosperity, not because of its overall ranking, but because many of the provinces of China are ranked even higher than Hong Kong and Singapore for economic freedom. Not political freedom, as my wife can well tell you, but for economic freedom, it's pretty good place. And those rankings make those provinces the engines of growth for China, lifting 756 million people out of poverty, unparalleled in human history throughout the world, over a 30-year period of time. And this guy tells a very interesting story called China's Great Migration, about how it was possible to bring about this astounding growth in prosperity because of China's Great Migration from the worst and most controlled and most autocratic portions of China to the most prosperous portions of China. And therefore, I would add a sixth criteria that incorporates things like the movement of not just products across border, but people across borders. It incorporates regulation of labor. It incorporates the legal and property rights. It incorporates all kinds of things from the other factors, but I would include that in the important fact. I've been urging the Fraser Institute to include this, but there are some people in the Fraser Institute that are dead set against migrants, and so they don't include that. But the world is filled with migration. This chart, interestingly, shows the wide range of movements from continent to continent, or even within countries. And this part here represents the massive internal migration of China just in 2015. Now, it's been said by Bradley Gardner that the poverty declined by 753 million people, and the internal migration accounted for 20 to 30% of that GDP growth over that period of time. Now, that means that the Chinese migration was about 260 million just within China. 260 million people. Now, in the whole world, there's only 232 million people migrating from one country to another internationally. But these are just the internal migration of China. And compare that to, well, the reasons that the European Union and the the European Union formed together to find a place where people could move freely in the European Union. And it first came out, when they were first proposing allowing Poland and all the Eastern European countries into the European Union. They said, oh no, they're all going to leave Poland. Well, we know well that people didn't all want to leave Poland. Many left for jobs, but a lot of investment came in here so that Poland had very, very good growth as a consequence. But only 13 million people in the European Union migrated internally. In the United States accepts about 41 million migrants from abroad, but China has had 260 million people move just internally. Now, Ortega and Perry have done some astounding research that very, very carefully tracks this, and they came to this conclusion: openness to knowledge, skills, and ideas from the rest of the world may be one of the most important engines of economic growth and technological advancement for a country. We show that openness to immigration is a strong predictor of its income per person and works much better for immigration than for trade. That explains why Hong Kong could go from a very, very poor backwater with no resources at all except human beings and the openness to trade to an astounding success story. And the same was true of this little fishing village in Shenzhen that became as prosperous as Hong Kong. And I show in my own research here that countries that are more open to migration are much more likely to be the ones that are success stories. When people are allowed to move from areas of low total factor productivity to other higher areas, it's been argued by University of Wisconsin economist John Kennan that it could double the world's wealth. I contend that it would be far more than that if actually people were allowed to move. This is a picture of my wife, as you may have guessed, and I think she's much more productive at my house than she was where she was before. A friend of mine, Drew Suter, said, well, you know, there's room around the world for a lot of Hong Kongs. Queen Charlotte Island, for example, now has a population of 5,000, could accommodate 9 Hong Kongs by area if they just simply allowed people to go there and to practice the trade and the freedom market that Hong Kong does. Vancouver Island's 24 could accommodate 28 Hong Kongs. I mean, he was a kind of a space guy. He says, you know, everybody values all this oil sands up here for all the tremendous wealth. They said the estimated value of all that oil wealth could be 14 trillion. But he says the wealth could be far, far greater generated. And for all the people of Alberta, if could get a big share of it too, if they just simply allowed people to go there and create, well, 58 Hong Kongs in that area. You may have recognized my brother over here. I think it's amazing, actually, that the whole world has policies trying to get oil. From everywhere in the world. They'll go to war for it. They'll do anything to get oil, barrels of oil. And every country in the world has barriers against human beings. As if barrels of oil are more valuable than human beings. And frankly, I think my brother's here is worth more than a barrel of oil. He doesn't just burn up. He's got a brain, he's got hands and legs, and he laughs really loud. Barrels of oil can't do that. The United States has vast open spaces. Only 3% of all the land area of the United States is cities and suburbs. That's a lot of open space. You fly over the United States and you can fly for hours looking down on wide open spaces. I know a lot of people don't like the idea of people coming to the United States, but because they think we're all going to be crowded in and all that. But you know, everybody moves to cities. Throughout history and throughout the world, yes, some people have moved to the countryside, but overwhelmingly people move to cities because they like crowds. That's where the economies of scale are, the comparative advantage, the division of labor, all the context and energy that makes prosperity. That's why they go to those places. And interestingly enough, New York and California both have more people in the cities, because New York City and Los Angeles are growing, at the same time as they have more space in the state of New York and the state of California, because people overall are leaving those states to go to other places. Can people actually find a livelihood out in the middle of deserts? Yeah, this was a desert once, just before they legalized gambling, and then suddenly it became Las Vegas, one of the most popular destinations, certainly the most popular destination for people from Hawaii to go to every time. Says Stuart Anderson, immigrant entrepreneurs are the heroes of the market-based economy, driving innovation and job creation. They started 33% of U.S. venture-backed public companies in that time period. These are names of these famous companies that in whole or in part were founded by immigrants. Here's another article by Adrian Furman that says this percentage of the companies, this is the origin of the entrepreneurs in the United States in 2016, almost a third of all the entrepreneurs. The people who are coming are very, very entrepreneurial. They're creating jobs, creating products. Immigrants founded 51% of US dollar-based startups. I noticed during the World Cup, almost every country in the world wanted to have the best talent and the best football players from all over the planet to come to work on play on their teams because they wanted to win. Well, why shouldn't companies and corporations be able to have that same opportunity to hire people, the best and the brightest, that make their team succeed? As for teams, yeah, I like teams. I can find a loyalty to the Dallas Cowboys or the Green Bay Packers or whatever. I haven't gotten so interested in soccer so much recently, I shouldn't have to pay for the stadium. That's where I disagree on issues of loyalty. I'll have all kinds of loyalties to my family, to my friends, to football games, but I don't want to be forced to pay for their privileges. Now, a nice thing about immigrants is that they have a very common match with all the characteristics of good entrepreneurs. This guy here, Bill Zinke, wrote up a list of all the characteristics that he thought were good characteristics for entrepreneurs. And I found that there was an astounding match with immigrants. It's a self-selective process. The people who are too lazy to move are not going to go just to get welfare. They're going because they have a lot of talent and diligence. What does Adrian Furman say? Why do foreigners make better entrepreneurs? First-generation migrants start businesses at twice the rate of Native Americans and of second-generation migrants. Half of the world's skilled migrants go to America and in 20 years created 25% of all American venture-backed companies. Sort of people who migrate have a different pattern of motivation, abilities, and adjustment. They are hungrier, more risk-taking, and more hardy. The whole of human history is this movement around the planet. It's been from the beginning. I mean, whether the beginning was in Ethiopia or Morocco or whatever, it is natural to us to flee tyranny, to flee famine, and to go to places where there's greater opportunity. And by the way, it's at the root of all of our religions. Abraham and Sarah fled famine in order to find a place where they could eat and survive. Same thing with Jacob and Joseph and by the way, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus had to flee the persecution of King Herod. What if they had to walk up to a wall that said, "Nope, sorry, go back"? I think it's at times like this that Christians, in considering migration policy, might ask, what would Jesus do? And Muhammad, he fled persecution of Mecca in order to survive when all of his followers were being persecuted. In American history, of course, there were slaves who broke the law against leaving their slave masters. I mean, after all, they were property. It was property that stole themselves if they ran away to somewhere else where they could be free. And they weren't much liked in the North. I mean, they were black and they had no manners and culture that was familiar to the Northerners. But there were some who welcomed them and helped them escape by the Underground Railroad to Canada or to Mexico where there wasn't any slavery. Now, they broke the laws, but I think they had a right to do so. And I think that it didn't matter whether the guard was at the plantation keeping them there in chains or the guard on the other side of the boundary that sent them back. The effect was the same, whether the guard was on one side or the other side. The effect was the same. It was collaboration with the tyrants. Now, America's had a long history of welcoming immigrants. And my great-grandfather came from Holland to the United States. And a lot of people did, by the millions. Now, this is absolute numbers, not as a percentage of the population, but there was a very large percentage of the population of migrants coming into the United States, and this shows it by population group. Actually, after a while, they weren't welcomed by the people that were there. The Irish were hated because they're papists, they're Catholics, they believe in the Pope, they're not like good Protestants. And people didn't like Negroes and Mexicans. And well, actually, the first laws against migration were the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, there's no question about it. It was a racist law. It was not so much a religious law, but it was in fear of labor competition. They were labor contract companies that went to China, went to Japan, went to Portugal, bringing people to Hawaii and islands to work the sugar plantations, but they also took them to California to build the railroads. Instead of being appreciative of them building the railroads, the white laborers felt that they were out-competing them because they were willing to work harder and at longer hours and for less money. And so they passed the first quotas. Actually, they outlawed all Asians. Every Asian was a Chinese to them. But it was the first time that people were treated the same as products. We have quotas in sugar, we're going to have quotas on people. And a head tax, which was the tariff. And this has had tragic consequences throughout American history and throughout world history. The Council at Evian, just before World War I, came to a ruling, no increase in the quota for all those Jews and people from Eastern Europe that were trying to flee the Nazism of Hitler, the fascism of Mussolini, the communism of Stalin. The quota was full. So Anne Frank's parents twice applied for a visa to the United States, twice turned down. Now, I frankly hold the people who turned them down for an opportunity to escape also responsible for what happened to them. Because it doesn't matter on which side of the border you get stopped. If you're turned back to tyrants, to gas chambers and tyranny, the effect is the same. There were people who violated the law, broke the law to help these people nevertheless. You people know Schindler, Oskar Schindler from Schindler's List, the movie, but also I think it was near here, that he was doing his rescue work. But few people know about Chiune Funahara, the embassy, the Chinese consulate in Vilnius, that wrote out hundreds, if not thousands, of visas to send Jews off to Japan, in violation of his country's own rules. They fired him as soon as they found out. And Professor He, who was the Chinese consul general in Austria, in Vienna, who wrote out another 100,000 visas for Jews to escape to China. And they were unrecognized heroes until long after they were dead. People here know the tragedies of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain that went up, and how many people were trying to flee that wall that separated them from freedom, and how remarkable it was that people were willing to welcome them. Because it didn't only matter that they were being prevented from leaving, but if no one accepted them and let them come in, they would still be stuck in bad times. The United States is now considering a 2,000-mile wall across between Mexico and the United States. This wall is expected to be anywhere from 30 to 35 feet tall and 6 feet underground. This is the size compared to President Trump. Expectation is that with the first flash flood, it'll be washed away. But that just means more money for contractors to rebuild it again. This guy, Walt Statton, he was putting water bottles out on the main trails where hundreds upon hundreds of people were dying out in the deserts trying to come into the country, and put out water on those places so they could survive. And he was convicted of the crime of littering. And his penalty was 60 days of community service. He said, I thought that's what I was doing. These guys, Penn and Teller, decided to hire some immigrants in 3 different teams to see, after they built the wall, a section of the wall to spec, how long it would take them to get to the other side. He gave them a prize. The first team that would get it either under, through, or over the wall. All 3 teams got to the other side in less than 3 minutes. People object to what they see. Lots of people that are unfamiliar and they don't know their motives. They don't know anything about them. They fear them. They're a threat. And yet they don't see what they can become. And we owe, as Austrian economists, a great debt of gratitude to the fact that people like Hayek and Mises and Ayn Rand were allowed to escape during those hard times. But how many others didn't get it, didn't get out? How many others like them were killed in the process? Here's my great-grandfather. Well, I've already told you about my comparisons then, but I think that there is a kind of welfare that drives immigration. is the welfare to tyrants around the world. It is the military intervention and the foreign aid and drug wars that is a kind of support to the tyrants in these countries that often leaves these people leaving. You know, there was a comment earlier about, well, aren't those wars in the Middle East all religious wars? Actually, America shouldn't forget that, well, actually, all the European empires, Germany, France, England, Italy, Portugal, Netherlands, Belgium, all of those empires, and the American empire as well, were largely, it was impossible to separate the state from the religious mandates, often the Christian mandate of manifest destiny, which led to empires around the world. And we are still feeling the consequences of the things that brought. All the lines in the Middle East were drawn by the British and the French, and they didn't take good regard about Kurdistan, right? There's another kind of welfare that drives immigration, and that's protectionist barriers. Americans aren't allowed to buy sugar at 5 cents a pound on the world market. They have to pay 4 times as much to buy sugar from the United States. But that impoverishes people around the world. It's not just sugar. The United States, and worse still, the European Union, and worse still, Japan, have the highest trade barriers on agricultural products, things that people around the world could easily produce and could supply an enormous prosperity for themselves. But that kind of welfare to domestic protectionist interests damages the opportunities for them to earn a living where they are. How about American welfare? Well, my research suggests that if people were coming for the welfare, they would go to the states that offered the most welfare. But the research shows just the opposite. They go to the states overwhelmingly with the least amounts of welfare. They don't go to the states, they leave the states with the greatest amounts of welfare. And Hawaii is among the highest, is the highest actually. Besides, welfare isn't caused by the immigrants. Welfare is created by the socialist state of the United States. It's created by the people who vote for it here. And if they've made it available to immigrants, it's not their fault. In other words, you can't make one kind of liberty conditional on getting rid of another kind of government intervention. The government intervention is harmful to people in the United States as well as to other countries. There's a lot of crime around the world, and people are very, very fearful about the crime from immigrants. Are they going to cause this terrible crime? And there are a lot of instances, and it's definitely worthwhile looking at it. But overall, the crime rates are down. And the crime rates are higher among Native Americans in the United States than they are immigrants. And in Germany, the crime rate is as low as it's been for 30 years. So, but there is crime. And there's certainly something to be taken very, very seriously. I don't deny that at all. One criminal, one of the biggest domestic terrorists in the United States was a guy named Timothy McVeigh. He was a domestic terrorist. And he went from New York to Oklahoma City and bombed the Murrah Federal Building, killing hundreds of innocent victims in that federal building. But I wouldn't put up a wall around New York just because he came from New York. That is a collectivist response to crime. As Ayn Rand put it, racism is the most primitive form of collectivism. And the idea that people or a race or religion is responsible for crime is, as a broad swath, incorporating all those people into it, is a collectivist answer. We must hold individual criminals accountable for their behavior. Execute them as they did. That's fine with me. Deport someone who commits a crime. That's okay with me. But don't hold everybody else as hostage to the opportunities of freedom and productivity and prosperity because of the actions of some. Every country has domestic terrorists of its kind. And they all deserve the same kind of harsh treatment to get rid of violent behavior. And I have to keep remembering, the most violent behavior against Americans is conducted by the US government itself. I mean, I ask my students how much money has been stolen from them over the years. I mean, it's a tiny fraction of what they expect the government to steal from them in their future. It's a tiny fraction of the number of people that the US government has killed in other countries. Now there is this problem. People with private property who are excluders, they don't want immigrants in their property, have a right to that. That is a libertarian right to their property. But people who are inviters, who want to hire them, who want to be working for them, who want to offer their apartments and houses and products and goods, have a right to invite them. And by the non-aggression principle, these people have a right to prevent somebody from infringing on their rights, but they don't have a right to prevent those people from inviting people that they wish, especially people who are in such desperate need for opportunities. So I say, in overall, immigration, allowing immigration is practical. It brings a lot of positive, productive benefits to countries that allow it. It's humanitarian because it does an awful lot to reduce the human suffering around the world. And above all, it's ethical. It's ethical not to initiate violence against others, and it treats others as we would want them to treat us if we were in their shoes, God forbid. So, thank you very much. I'll leave it up to Marcin. Marcin, do we have time for questions, or shall we go to dinner and we just talk about...
I see that we have some questions, so let's say that we can have a time for 3 last questions.
Okay, okay. Nicole, by the way, I have to say what a fantastic presentation you gave today.
Thank you.
Dynamite.
Thank you. I just have one quick question. Just at the end, you mentioned you would, like in theory, support deporting immigrants if they commit crimes. Will you also support deporting Americans if they commit crimes?
A criminal's a criminal, but the problem is that the government is such a big criminal, it's hard to get a criminal to punish another criminal. and also, this idea that, we can't allow this person to come into the country because we have a welfare state. I mean, Milton Friedman gave this statement at our Puerto Vallarta conference. And he said, well, immigration's good, but not until the welfare state's gone. Well, that's never going to happen, so what does that mean? Even his parents who were immigrants wouldn't have been allowed because the state robbed some people to provide things for other people.
Yeah, send them to Hawaii.
Send them to Hawaii.
We can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. The same logic of not allowing someone to come into the country because the state provides all kinds of benefits, which is all a violation of non-aggression principle. Education, government-funded education, government welfare, all the things the government provides. That same logic could be used against people who want to have children. There are new people coming into the country. You can say, no, I'm sorry, you can't have children as long as the state's going to be responsible for their education, their welfare, and so on like that. No one would accept that. Now, they did in China. And that doesn't mean that it's out of the realm of possibility. The government is very creative in ways to try and infringe on our liberties and to apply their logic of the state-mandated welfare state against individual liberty. Yes, question?
First, I want to thank you for this great presentation and a very powerful message with many great points. But let me kind of play the devil's advocate.
I expected.
Today we have actually, I think, an anniversary of the battle that stopped the communist army from passing through Poland's borders. And today's warfare is not the same as it was at that time. Today's armies are sometimes not organized in battalions, in big groups that are visible to man's eye. How would you respond to the dangers that lie in armies that are composed of individuals sneaking into the country they are at war with? Of course, I can see that the main problem here is the United States being at war with many countries, but what other dangers would you, how would you comment on these dangers in another way?
That's a very powerful question. And I have to say that in Costa Rica, I gave a talk on this subject, and Ben Best, I don't know if any of you remember Ben Best, he asked the same kind of question in the context of what if the North Korean government sent an army of soldiers to invade America on the pretense that they're just immigrants, you know. And my sort of flippant response was, well, my guess is that an army of North Korean invaders, the instant they got across the border, would suddenly become, you know, traitors to their country and would be delighted at the freedom and opportunities. Okay, but that's a flippant answer. Yes, it is possible that that can happen, and I don't have an absolute answer to that. I've pondered that for a lot of years. I think it's possible that countries may do that sort of thing. First off, it's very important for the United States to do all the things that reduces the likelihood of someone wanting to invade the United States, and that's to stop doing the interventionism all around the world in 300 major bases, 2,000 minor bases all around the world with interventionism plans everywhere. And to enrich those countries by stopping the drug wars and stopping the trade wars that make it hard for them to earn a living where they are, stop the trade, the support of tyrants abroad. Okay, maybe they still want to invade, and that's a possibility. I think a case could be made to respond to that with a barrier. That said, that should not be used as an excuse to prevent thousands of hard-working people, and I've met them, thousands of hard-working people who want to come into the United States just to pick lettuce, that Americans want to eat, but Americans aren't going to pick the lettuce themselves. And if we don't allow them to come in, then those companies will move abroad. So I mean, it's very beneficial to Americans hiring them. I was talking about this in an international trade class, in migration and so on, and this custodian came in to start to empty the garbage. And he looked like he was from another country, so I just stopped the class and I said, excuse me, where are you from? He says, I'm from the Philippines, sir. And what did you do in the Philippines before you came here? I was a political science professor. People are willing to take extraordinary risks. And I really appreciate that kind of courage to do those sorts of things that I wish that I would have the courage myself to do if I was in their shoes. And I wonder about these people who get onto rickety boats from Haiti or Cuba to come across the Mariana Straits, where sharks, pirates, hurricanes, exposure kill probably a quarter of the people trying to come across the passageway there to come to Florida and not get caught. And many of them just die. I admire the guts and courage. I don't think I'd have the courage. That's why I'm trying to speak now to stop tyranny when it's easy to do nothing. And that's, I think, an important thing for us to distinguish between the invading army and the people who just want a better opportunity for their lives and for their families. And when the people are escaping horrible gangs that are fueled by our drug wars in Central America, in Guatemala, and El Salvador, and Honduras, the trade barriers against them even selling flowers or sugar to the United States, and then the drug wars where we fuel the armies down there to fight in these drug wars, and the drug gangs get very rich and powerful because of the prohibition. These poor people are caught in between. I don't blame them for trying to flee, but I've known a friend of mine from China. He went from China to Ecuador. He borrowed money from his family in China. It cost him over $50,000 for this journey by land, working his way, not knowing a single word of Spanish, and coming all the way eventually to Hawaii. And he learned the language, he learned the skills, he developed a company, he invited finally his whole family was able to come because he had 2 children. The government of the United States said, well, you're going to be persecuted by your government for having more than 1 child. So he was able to get asylum for his family. I mean, this guy took 10 years of his life, great fortune, great hardship, to create a life for his family. And I think he's one of the most courageous guys I have ever met. And he's surrounded by all these friends that are doing the same kind of thing. Yeah, okay. Yeah, Terry.
Boy, I like your presentation. I have some suggestions. It's not 0 or 100%, so I'm in agreement with an enormous amount of what you're saying. But I think that you're also saying it's not 0 or 100%. So we should close the border and have no one come in. Or we should open the border and everybody can walk in. Because we have two problems with that. But somewhere in the middle, we have to reach the ground, humanitarian ground. Do we want to let people in who would do us harm? Like the drug and the murdering gangs, or hear about in the States, for example, or Islamic terrorists who want to come in to kill us because we're the devil. So that's a challenge. But the other problem is, so I'm in favor of legal immigration, absolutely, and you're in favor of legal immigration. The great sense, and then of course how you define the rules fairly or not. But the problem that I have is, if you set the bar to unlimited immigration, then right now the problem is that you have enormous numbers of people who have been waiting in line, have applied by the rules, have paid their fees, have gone to in this case, the American Embassy, and they're waiting when, of course, lots of other people are jumping the queue.
Yeah, I know that argument, okay.
Sure.
The queue is not the fault of the well-qualified immigrant. The queue is the inefficient stupidity of government bureaucracy that only deals with 5 people a day when they've got 1,000 people. And what business would treat their customers in such a way? Any business that sees a long line of people trying to come through and access the services, would put on open more gates. But the government, the U.S. closes them down. When my wife and I were going through the immigration counter at Helsinki, just to get here, I went to one gate, she went to the other gate that was open, and they let me right in. And they gave her 20 minutes of trouble. We had the same U.S. passport. The only thing that I can distinguish that was the difference was that she was of Chinese ancestry and I wasn't. And, it's so easy for a lot of people to get here, but who didn't get visas to come here? We had people from India who were denied visas. We had people from Mongolia who were denied visas. We had people from Lebanon who would have been denied visas if they hadn't found other ways around it. There were, I don't know where else, Nepal, we had people, Kurdistan probably. We had people, and they're putting up arbitrary barriers. And okay, I'll accept that we don't allow the ISIS members to come. I'll go along with that.
9/11 terrorists, they all legal immigrants.
Yeah, that's true. They were all from Saudi Arabia. There's never been a barrier on Saudi Arabia, but all those terrorists from 9/11 were Saudi Arabia, and they all came on student visas. And the U.S. government isn't going to close down student visas, or else all the universities would be upset. And 2 of those terrorists who flew into the World Trade Center, 2 of them received the renewal of their student visa 2 months after the attack, and they had already died. I mean, that's how inefficient and incompetent the system is.
Middle class people well off.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, okay, well.